Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom podcast, episode number 90. And we will be talking about invented languages, glossolalia, and something I like to call interpreting gibberish, even. It's the language before language. It's kind of the concept of the word before meaning. And way back in our first podcast, we talked about, our very first podcast was back in June of 2021, and it was called Lovecraft, Jung's Black Books, and Dark Gnosis. And I think our third podcast was on Cryptic Ruins Translated, Dream Symbols from Jung, Dr. John Dee, and Lovecraft. All of those in that, what I like to call the lockdown era. And we jumped into the details. And as you guys know, we do the podcast series. It's a lecture series. It's in the tradition of a lot of the books that we've talked about on the tabletop. A lot of books I like to read, like the Lacan lecture series, or Foucault's lectures, or even the letters of H.P. Lovecraft. I kind of like these raw texts. It's the same style that we do here in the podcast. A lot of prep goes into this in a strange way. It's where there's concepts that we're working on. I mean, a little bit, this podcast is kind of the inside baseball of our publishing. So we're in the process of writing or editing or putting out volumes. A lot of the work that's going into the research that are in those books are kind of like what we're exploring here together. So I really appreciate you guys listening in and hope it's interesting for people. And then to make this sort of documented a bit, I do want to have a record going forward. And it gives me a chance to clean up some of these podcasts and make them somewhat readable. In the lecture series. I think we've got 5 volumes of this now, and I've started to group them by things like the esoteric Saturn mysteries, the esoteric dragon mysteries. I mean, listen, it's not for everyone. If you're a person who doesn't like the raw format, obviously you can go somewhere else. But I kind of always like to get the insights of listening in on a lecture or a podcast, in the sense of, this is where the ideas are coming from and gestating, and this is what ends up in some of the other works. So back in that first podcast, we jumped into the idea of Jung's Black Books, were his notebooks. They were actually his notebooks. You can see this version of the Black Book here has the end papers, shows the actual end papers of the book, and some handwritten letters here. And see, this was the actual end papers of what the journal looked like. So they've kind of reproduced it in detail here. It's got some drawings and sketches here, right? And in that cryptic symbols translated, Jung had dreamt that he had met a sorcerer named Ha. I'll leave this page open here because you can see these cryptic symbols that he found. And I think in the Dr. D correlation, as we talked about Dr. D's showstone, I've got a piece of obsidian here to memorialize Dr. D's obsidian mirror. But he would read the Enochian script from that mirror. That's how he interpreted the Enochian script. But if we go to this, footnote here, it says. So Jung has this dream of Ha, the black magician, Jung calls him, and he shows him these symbols in his dream, and Jung kind of translates them down. And he says, of course, he had articulated the reading of Philemon's character, so we're learning how to read a character against a particular psychic background. And they created these spelled out ruins. And while Jung himself kept pace with this, nonetheless, his impressions of the show's first undertaking of the exchange was some disconcerting fact. He's got these symbols that he wanted to, what do I do with them? How do I translate them, right? And I kind of thought that was quite interesting launching point to talk about some of the work that we've been doing on this podcast, and also in some of these volumes that we have. So I think maybe I'll start out with the idea of where I first encountered, let's call invented languages first. So, invented languages for me probably began when I had my paperback trilogy of The Lord of the Rings, and I opened up to the appendix of this book, and then there was the Tengwar Elven script here, the Fëanorian letters of the Kenya. And I think a similar thing happened when I did get the paperback again version of the Silmarillion, where it had the glossary of Elvish words, you know. And then we also have the runes with their pronunciation, and a whole appendix on the languages and peoples of the Third Age. So I found that this stuff was super amazing to just go down the rabbit hole. And I think I spent some time very much obsessed with that. Well, obviously more than some time. I'm still in that space, I guess. But if you look at the quote here, Tolkien's sort of language, Elven language interest kind of came out of his idea of looking at the history of the different Germanic traditions, like let's say the sagas from Iceland. So it says generalized succession of this match heterogeneous material. One of the time, Tolkien derives some part of his invention and vital part from entirely novel solution to an old mythological problem. There is no doubt that a belief in elves, the Old Norse Alfar or the Old English Elf, was widespread in Germanic antiquity, but the words used about them seem curiously contradictory. The Icelander Snorri Sturluson, whose prose account of Norse mythology remains our only half-coherent account, was aware of both light elves, Joslafar, and the dark elves, the Doklafar, but also the Svart elves, Svartalfar, the Swart elf home, Svartalfarheim, which is the home of the dwarves. So there's like wood elves, wood delf, and water elf. How are all these fragments to be fitted together? Are Svart elves the same as dark elves, or perhaps they're the same as dwarves? The OED seemed to accept this solution, cross-referencing dwarf and elf, but he found the notion somewhat feeble. So I think that in his desire to break out these linguistic origins, he sort of fictionalized it. I mean, it's just, I kind of took I just take it this way. He just took those old fairy concepts and fictionalized them in such a way that he could create those languages. And then it is quite effective, let's just say from a world of fiction, to have these fictional accounts and fictional languages in place, because you can you really get saturated in the world building. I think of another one is, you know, if I go to more modern times, I just think of, even although George Martin didn't invent those languages fully as they did in the series, you know, they had Dothraki and they had High Valyrian. He did have lots of these High Valyrian words. I mean, Valar Morghulis and things like those words. I think he did have the concept, at least, of the High Valyrian speech. If he didn't, there's no appendix, though, in George Martin. But I think he does have the idea, probably from Tolkien too. And a lot of fantasy writers, they do have some kind of desire to have these kind of fictional languages in. But also the ability that you could speak to the dragons with these languages. There's all kinds of fun stuff that one can do with, you know, fantasy realm invented languages. Even looking at Star Trek with Klingons. I mean, this is such a nerd thing, right? The Klingonese is, people learn it, people study it. I mean, you can actually, all the corrections to this podcast mistake are in, if you want to check those out, those are in the Klingon translation track down below. But then there's another example of invented languages that I always appreciated, and it's not really invented, but in Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, he doesn't use invented languages, but he does use sort of medieval terms in a kind of interesting way. So he has a note on the translation. The rendering of this book, originally composed in a tongue that has not yet achieved existence, into English, I might have easily saved myself a great deal of labor by having recourse to invented terms. But instead, I was forced to replace undiscovered concepts with their closest 20th century equivalents. Such words as peltast androgen, and exultant are substitutions of this kind and are intended to be suggestive rather than definitive. Metal is usually, but not always, employed to designate a substance of the sort the word suggests to contemporary minds. But he also goes and uses words that are like autark and destrious and sapans, and there's tons of word terminus est. He has, he even calls earth urth. So I think there's some amount of this kind of invented language there as well. But I think something interesting kind of comes to us through Lovecraft, where in Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, say for example, we have the famous, in his house in Rillia dead Cthulhu waits dreaming, Finglui Meglonaf Cthulhu Rillia Wagen Nagal Fatagen, right? So this is the great quote of Lovecraft's language. I think he speaks of it a bit in his letters, and maybe it came to him in a dream or a nightmare or something like that, but all of these things are kind of in that same vein, right? And I find that this idea of not an invented language, but a kind of placeholder for meaning before the word, or the proto-language, or the language of the unconscious, right? There's something about this that was interesting. So in that works, we have this tradition of the August Moldenhauer's psychoanalysis of Rillier, part of the Kathu Journals, in which there are some discoveries of this kind of thinking, right? So if you take the concept of, let's say, a Necronomicon Fragment, right? So the Necronomicon Fragment here seems like random gibberish, right? So if you look at each passage of the fragment, you'll see that there's some bits of letters, kind of like when we reconstruct an ancient text. We've got the Lost Cypria on tabletop as well. Lost Cypria being kind of a modern attempt to recreate a Greek lost text that we know existed, but we no longer have. So this is another one of the works that you could go check out in our bookstore. Lost Cypria, the prequel, let's call it, to the Iliad and the Odyssey, one of the prequels. So it has the judgment of Paris, and then there's also included in this one the binding of Saturn as maybe the roots of that distress that is the Trojan War and the capriciousness of the Olympians. So in this Necronomicon fragment, you can see not only transliterations of the words, but an attempt to translate it. It says here, the layer 3 exists as the second largest layer of the Necronomicon fragment, extended from top to bottom along the right-hand side of the document. It should be noted that this part of the layer is in the region known as the Cthulhu Head Nebula, towards the bottom of the region known as the Lovecraft Silhouette. And it's like, Oe ia, oe ku sepontek suag nibli, altered lock nervane plum into tesmeno, napthieon, grabd ibda, tater endrictet, nathumua grabda rebeta puthini relana. So the chilling details come in the final sentence, which is captured in the moment of dissolving into a new layer. Notice how the words magnapus and nankurma have always been transformed, likely prior states of thamapas and reklermu. The Thapnan's suspicions become Mlapnar's paranoia, and the reklermu parting becomes Nekrmu, which is akin to the Lacanian notice of foreclosure associated with psychosis. The text seems to fade from that thought, which might be perceived, to the thought which cannot be forgotten, averted, or bypassed. So you see there's an attempt here by Moldenhauer to take what is seemingly the Rillian script and to convert it into something that's kind of like a fiction of interpretation. So where Tolkien gives you an invented language that is meant to allow you to get to know the various beings whether they're dwarves or elves or orcs. We have this, or or even in other realms, if they're Klingons or Dothraki or Targaryens, right? The languages are meant for us to learn about the culture through this, but with something like the psychoanalysis of Rillia, those languages are now meant to be, I want to say they are codifications of a kind of unconscious. So if we go into the, there's also the Providence ciphers, which are included in the psychoanalysis of Rillia. There are translations for those in the original Moldenhauer version. So, for example, the translation of the Providence Cipher 1, which is transliterated as paragraph 1, it's here. Maybe I'll show it to you because it's probably easier for you to look at it than for me to read it. Right? It says, Singlaran neran replana megax were really gingos fumigas nanglangamang gothic nachthigmengwar the cathagmen gugmas pair with mingdong what. And it says the Providence Cipher translated from the August Moldenhauer's follow, Cthulhu, the Hidden One, has fallen from outer space, unfolded from deep cauldrons of dark matter, hidden origins unknowable as unsung songs, where he finds ocean as encircling world serpent, coiled in his chosen sleep until the twilight of the gods, waveform delight, epicycling outward, harmonic and discordian. This thing shunts within its own endless seizure, a night terror, a stillborn dream of theft, a hope that is a fear, a waking that is only starborn, forgotten now in a watery grave. It says the key, so Moldenhauer goes on, the key vocabulary translated by the manuscript is as follows. Ragnarklath is the Norse Midgard serpent, and Regloch perhaps is related to Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. And then there's several words that have kithim, like kithim, werganak, werglergesongflap, is the prefix for hidden, burned, earthy, unknown, buried. So the first first paragraph of the Providence Cipher is an invocation of the fallen Cthulhu from the sky. So it's almost like could be the fall of Satan, right? So you start seeing that these are unconscious things that come out in the Rillian text. Now, if we go later in the later version, we also have Giuseppe Balsamo's version of these translations. He also translates the examples of Moldenhauer, but he also moves into translations that Moldenhauer does not translate. It says, for example, this translation was left untranslated by August Moldenhauer in the Psychoanalysis of Rillia. And it says, this is fragment 7 of the Providence Cipher, and you can see this here. And then the translation is, the dream mantras nesting in the mind in sleep's appositorium conjunctionis of sleep and death, attuning to Rillia transmissions of mad alignment, sleep-inducing dream, cleaving away, sanity. Cthulhu's dream is the dark core lighthouse, our North Star, eclipsing the galactic center from zero time. Lifeless, mute Cthulhu, silent working mind, cycle through the extracorporeal chakras to bind the void to the flesh. So this was left untranslated by Moldenhauer. I think it's, in some way, it's the why would something be left untranslated, right? And this is kind of the thing. The ninth fragment was also left untranslated by Moldenhauer, but was translated by Balsamo in the Necromancy of Nyarlathotep. At last Cthulhu wakens from his watery grave, and the dreamtime madness of Rillia opens as talisman. Well, a lot of these things, aren't they in some ways just the unconscious, right? I think we've done a lot of podcasts on Lovecraft here. And I think the theme that threads them all together is that Lovecraft is kind of the reluctant, reading Lovecraft as a reluctant clairvoyant or a reluctant remote viewer or a reluctant remote viewer of history. Much like Dr. D, we have Dr. D and Edward Kelly here in the act of invoking a spirit of a deceased person. An image by Ebenezer Sibley from 1806, right? And I think that this kind of idea also gets described in the Necromancy of Nyarlathotep in the Kathu Journals as reading itself is a necromantic spell, right? We write down something, the author dies, and then the words live on in some way. But if the words live on, aren't those words mostly the words of the conscious? How do we capture the words of the unconscious? And I think one way is this idea of the translation of something that's invented forces one to record, just like the Jungian dream, the idea of symbols that have no meaning, but yet they are given in a context of meaning. And then the wrestling with that meaning is almost an asking of the unconscious on how to surface what could be there. But how would one trap that? Like, think of it as a Philip K. Dick experiment. Philip K. Dick can somehow place his own madness and project it down into a book so that he can keep that mystery of it, or the unknowability of it, or the unconsciousness, the unconscious bridge gets captured in a weird way. It's like a dream journal, right? When we write down our dreams, we don't necessarily have to interpret them, but if we just write down what happens in the dream, in a way you're keeping a record of some unconscious activity, right? And I think that this kind of interpreting of nonsensical languages, or perhaps they aren't nonsensical, right? And I think that that leads us to the idea of a lot what is in the deep space of, let's say, the way a large language model in AI is learning from all of our texts. If we look at the substrate of the machine learning layers, the sort of the neural network layers or the generative layers, a lot of those areas are vector maps of language. So, for example, one thing about, let's say if you have a bunch of sentences like a red apple, a red car, a green apple, and a green car, right? So if you take the red vector, maybe red points to this color, green points to this color. And then if you move it to the domain of cars, we just move that same angles of the vectors and we move it to point to, now you can tell the green and red part distinguishing the cars and the green and red part. So the difference between green and red is the same thing when we apply it to apples or to cars. And that's a mathematical quantity, right? But this is happening at a very deep, and I almost want to call it something like an intuitive level, although it's algebraic, right, in a machine learning model. So I do think that there's something magical there about the idea of a proto-language or words before language. So I think, one of the things that it kind of makes me think of is the wonder that comes when one reads Borges's labyrinths, the Tlon, Ukbar, and Orbis Tertius. And if you're familiar with this one, we've also talked about it before, but the idea is he finds a encyclopedia, and one of the volumes, the 11th volume, has this word Tlon in it. And he kind of goes into Tlon, and he finds that there was a whole number of entries that this actual encyclopedia is from another world that was called Orbis Tertius. And it's like, how did this encyclopedia end up in our world? And I think the wonder that this evokes is one of the magic tricks that Borges does in his, what we call world building. And I think that we explored last time when we talked about the volume 5 of the Alchemical Courtship. Some of the work that goes on in this does also have an appendix called the Lexicon of the Gibbering Grammar of Chaos. And again, there's in contrast to the formal structure system of Rillian, which can at least be analyzed through non-Euclidean geometry and twisted recursive logic, The subnigration reveals in its formlessness, it's a language that embodies the overwhelming fecundity of the universe, the relentless and horrifying cycle of birth, consumption, and decay. And to the listener, it sounds like a cacophony of overlapping, disjointed gibbering where no single voice dominates, but rather all elements blend into chaos. And this is the language that Cthulhu's mathematics can be spoken in. And we have some different examples of this kind of language from the last book, because the protagonist of, or let's say the antagonist of Regret, Redemption, and Resurrection is kind of a combination of the blurred lines between Cthulhu's sunken city R'lyeh sinking and the idea of sunken Atlantis. How is the vector map to both Atlantis sinking and R'lyeh sinking related? I think we kind of talked about this in our last podcast. Today we want to talk about the next volume, volume 6, which is Fireborn, Irebound, and Ireborn. And I think just as a side note, these we recently are republishing these for larger distribution. But Regret, Redemption, Resurrection, volume 5, this was actually published quite a while ago. It was 2019 from the inside here, from Near East Media Press. Regret, Redemption, and Resurrection. So these newest versions are just an attempt at our moving the book publishing over to Pontos Fathom Press. And in Fireborn, Ironbound, Ireborn, we continue the journey of Saturn in Lovecraft's Dreamlands, a Saturn who's unbound. And there's a number of places that we can look at it. We talked about in an earlier podcast from one of the earlier volumes from Hope's Home, Hysteria's Heart, about the Lost Cypria, which tells this tale of the unchaining of Saturn, and also sort of reconstructs some of this, some of the Homeric Greek. In Tartarus's shadowed heart, where Kronos reigns, confined, his voice a whisper, born of night through darkness twined, Nyx, chaos, entities of void and night's embrace. Your semblance here by my grace finds its place, for I am the first dark, the womb from which you sprung, the silent depth where stars were hung. Yet in this moment by my will I grant you leave, an illusion of departure in which you believe. For we are bound in the web of cosmic fate, a tapestry vast that I in solitude contemplate. And though you walk from me into the veil of night, your essence remains within my eternal sight. And for all existence in Tartarus's grip does dwell a truth profound, and only I can tell. The Olympians in their celestial hall so bright dance upon my stage under my night. And as you fade, not absorbed, but by grace set free, remember that all this returns to me. For I am the fecund darkness, the primordial seed from which springs forth every creed. And now the tale unfolds, an apple darkly sown, bears the mark of chaos, in shadows grown. To Paris mortal hands will grasp the fruit of strife, igniting the flames of a war with petty gods rife. And with these words, the Titan in chains his solace found. And in silent depth where all creation is bound, in Nyx and chaos, their forms but shadows in the night, stepped forth into the void under his omniscient sight. Thus from Kronos' dark, the seeds of fate are cast. Into the future from the deep, an unending past, alone he remains, the first night, the undying under, in silence profound, the world's dark wonder. So we get this kind of history of Saturn there chained. You see him in the cover on the Grecian urn. Saturn bound by the Olympians, who I call the capricious Olympians. But in volume 5, Fireborn, Ironbound, Ironborn, we have the introduction of a Saturnian language. That is kind of like, if we imagine something akin to, let's call it Philip K. Dick's The Empire Never Died. What if there were an alien Latin that was from before Latin? Something like this, right? And we call this the lingua atrum Saturni. This stands apart from other esoteric languages of the dreamlands, such as Rillian or the astral tongues of Nyx and Erebus. It is not a language of mere words, but a force that embodies your Saturn's dominion over entropy, stasis, and recursive collapse. Unlike Rillian, which twists into chaotic fractals, the black speech reflects Saturn's paradoxical mystery, preserving the frozen stillness of eternity while fracturing itself into the spirals of dimensions. Every word spoken in the lingua atrium Saturni reverberates with the ontological weight, binding or unraveling the fabric in its syntax. Both recursive and paradoxical, it reflects the temporal distortion over which Saturn presides. And we have these lingua Saturnum atrium Saturni. The great example of this, the Eternal Chronicle of the young Saturn, the Saturnalis Thralmorin, are the Annales Tenebrae Saturnii, written by the devoted cultist priest Cualtalan Nexareth, and the annals are more than a historical account; they are the living document of that. So this whole appendix is also, if you choose to just approach it from the ideas of the appendix and you're interested in that kind of language in the sense of Black Gnosis, you can pick it up in the sense of legends from the Lovecraft Dreamlands. We also have this reproduced here, the grammar in the Black speech, and also some examples of the young Saturn here as well. So this is presented as a hymn. It's the hymnus, the hymn of the young Saturn, the hymnus Saturni Thralmorin, Nixialis Calar Verores Zephanor, Calmorin Calahir, Ereboriathes Calmoranth Aurier, Calahir Calir Eternalis. Now, I think these days we have so many of like artists that are doing this thing. I mean, everything from Enya to Sigur Rós, right? Sigur Rós, they don't really sing lyrics, right? They sing this kind of, it's evocative of lyrics. It's vocal, but it's something that's meant to be performed, and it's something that kind of taps, I think it taps into the unconscious. So I think that this is very interesting if people would like to hear it. I do have a small sample of it. You can go check out a short that we've uploaded, and I think we're going to start putting some of this as audiobooks out on our Patreon, so you guys can sample some of these. But if you want to take a listen to, this is the Hymnus Saturni Thralmorin. Let's play this. I probably played it for you before. But let's go.
Nixialis Calahir Velorit Sifonor Calmorin Calahir Ereborithis Calamora Thaurior Calahir Calrin Eternalis Saturnalis Thralmorin Aurior Calahir Aurenis Calmorin Athronilalis Calahir Calmirium.
So you guys get a little taste of it. I'll have the full track over there on the Patreon. You guys can listen to that. But here we, to make this performative, in Lovecraft's Dreamlands, we've got the city of Celophaeus. Obviously, there's the Celophaeus city, but there's also the city of Iron Dome de Dalathleen, and there the Crimson Princess. She presides over it, and she's the one who is brokering some deals with Saturn as he, unchained now in the Dreamlands, sort of decides to take action against the destabilizing effects that impact the Dreamlands. And it's sort of it's quite an unconscious journey, but it's also a documentation of sort of a collective unconscious, not only of ourselves, but of the idea of these forgotten gods themselves. Like, what is the unconscious of Saturn? Who was Saturn? What was his Freudian analysis, right? How did Saturn become Saturn? So a hymn to the young Saturn there. You get a little sample of that, sung by the Crimson Princess and Daleth Leen. I think some of this work will eventually make its way to, we've got plans for a graphic novel, and probably we'll move into some other production things that we'll go into a little bit next year. Talk about some changes that are coming from that. So if you guys are interested in that, that would be great to check it out. I think I can leave you all with that for now. But thank you very much for listening on our forgotten languages, invented languages, and meaning before the word. As always, guys, go leave your comments down below if you would like to discuss anything. I should be more diligent to have some kind of Discord or something like that that we could chat on, but let's use the comments for now. Really appreciate all of your subscribers. Hopefully everyone is doing well. Like I mentioned, go out to the Patreon. I'll start listing in the free tier some excerpt chapters from some of the earlier books from the saga. I'll also put a link to some of the audio production that we're doing for the audiobooks. So if you're not inclined to buy them, you can listen to some of that there. And your feedback would be super appreciated. And as always, hope everyone's doing well out there. We'll talk soon, and take care. Bye-bye.